The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch whispered it was a fitting match, the quiet woman who spoke more to her wilting sunflowers than to people, and the man arriving on the noon train, a groom bought sight unseen, clad in little more than dust and despair. They did not know that Ilara, in her silent world, saw not a beggar, but a reflection of her own unspoken plea for a gentle hand, and in his tattered arrival she sensed not an end, but the trembling beginning of what true love could be. The sun beat down on the warped planks of the Redemption Gulch station platform, baking the scent of creosote and despair into the dry air. Ilara Kane stood apart from the small, chattering knot of onlookers, her calico dress, though clean, as faded as the paint on her small, inherited farmhouse at the edge of town. Her bonnet shadowed a face that rarely sought the light, a face considered plain, unremarkable, like a field sparrow in a flock of painted finches. She clutched a worn reticule, its drawstrings tight, knuckles white. Inside, there was no money, only the letter, terse and practical, confirming passage for one Silas Mercer, her correspondent, her wager against a future of deepening solitude. The whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that echoed Ilara's own trepidation. Smoke billowed, cinders rained, and the iron horse hissed to a stop, the metallic groan a sigh of finality. A few drummers alighted, then a woman with two bright feathers in her hat. Then, him. Silas Mercer. He was not what the lurid pamphlets promised, no sturdy yeoman or hopeful merchant. He was a silhouette of want, etched against the harsh prairie light. His clothes, once dark, were bleached by sun and wear to the color of dust, threadbare at the elbows and knees, clinging to a frame made gaunt by hardship. A battered valise, its leather cracked and peeling, was his only companion. His hat, shapeless and stained, was pulled low, but as he stepped onto the platform and his gaze swept briefly, unseeingly, across the small crowd, Ilara saw his eyes beneath the brim. They were the color of a stormy sky, shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep, yet held a flicker, distant but discernible, of something unbroken, something that endured. A snicker rippled through the onlookers. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose prosperity was as loud as his waistcoat, guffawed. "Well, Ilara, looks like you got the pick of the litter, eh?" Or maybe the leavings, his cronies, Burl and Hank, echoed his cruel laughter. Ilara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a familiar shame. This was her gamble, laid bare for public amusement. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She could turn, walk away, pretend this was a mistake. Let the town mock her foolishness, it would be easier than facing this. But then Silas Mercer shifted, his weight settling as if bracing against an expected blow, and that small movement, that quiet resignation, snagged at something within her. She knew that stance. She lived it. He was an outcast, just as she was, albeit for different reasons. She, for her quiet nature and the shadow of her parents' early deaths, leaving her with a legacy of little more than arid land and pity. He, for his poverty, his evident hardship. The world had already judged him. She would not add her verdict to the heap. With a breath that barely disturbed the stillness of her bodice, Ilara Kane stepped forward, her shadow falling briefly over the worn toes of his boots. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for an instant, the noise of the station, the jeers, the simmering heat, all faded. There was only the silent query in his gaze, and the unspoken answer in hers. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was low, hardly more than a whisper, yet it cut through the lingering mockery. He gave a curt nod, his throat working. That was all. But in that single word, she heard not defiance, nor shame, but a profound exhaustion, and perhaps, a sliver of hope so fragile it might shatter with a harsh word. She would not speak it. "I am Ilara Kane," she offered her hand, not in greeting, but as an anchor. After a moment's hesitation, his calloused, dust-grimed fingers brushed hers, a touch surprisingly firm, surprisingly real. "The wagon is this way." The journey to the farm was a tapestry woven from the creak of wagon wheels, the rhythmic plod of the old mare, Molly, and a silence that stretched taut between them, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of uncertain futures. Ilara drove, her gaze fixed on the dusty track that snaked towards the low, sun-baked hills where her small homestead huddled as if seeking shelter from the vast, indifferent sky. Silas sat beside her, his posture rigid, his battered valise clutched between his knees. He did not speak, his eyes scanning the parched landscape, the sparse vegetation, the distant, shimmering heat haze, his expression unreadable. Ilara risked a sideways glance. The harsh sunlight carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes, testament to trials she could only imagine. His hands, resting on the valise, were strong, though roughened and scarred. They were the hands of a man who knew labor, even if his current state suggested that labor had yielded little reward. Her farm, when it came into view, offered no grand welcome. The small clapboard house listed slightly, its whitewash peeling like sunburnt skin. The barn sagged, its roof patched in several places. Fences, intended to delineate meager pastures, leaned at weary angles, their wires slack. A few chickens scratched listlessly in the dirt yard, and her sunflowers, usually a small defiance of color, drooped under the oppressive heat. It was a place of struggle, of making do, a reflection of her own quiet endurance. She saw him take it all in, his gaze lingering on the broken gate, the dry well, the air of neglect that clung to the place like dust. She felt a familiar pang of inadequacy, the urge to apologize, to explain. But the words caught in her throat. What was there to say? The farm was what it was. She was what she was. He, too, remained silent, offering no judgment, no comment. When she finally pulled Molly to a halt before the porch, he was the first to move, swinging down from the wagon with an economy of motion that spoke of weariness turned into habit. He reached for her valise, his own still in hand. "I can take that," his voice was raspy from disuse. She nodded, allowing him to help her down. The silence returned as they stood before the house, the only sound the buzz of a persistent fly and Molly sighing as she swished her tail. "It ain't much," Ilara finally said, the word small against the vastness of the land. But it's home. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a fleeting moment, the storm in his eyes seemed to quiet. "It's a start," he said, and the simple words, devoid of pity or promise, were more comforting than any polite platitude. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of shared work and persistent quiet. Silas proved a tireless worker. He moved with a purpose that belied his ragged appearance, his hands, though scarred, knowing their way around tools. He started with the fences, his movements methodical, efficient, resetting posts, tightening wires until they hummed faintly in the prairie wind. He cleaned the well, shored up a collapsing section of the barn roof, and even managed to coax a stubborn old pump back to life, bringing forth a trickle, then a steady stream, of precious water. Ilara worked alongside him when she could, tending her small vegetable garden, caring for the chickens, her hands busy, her mind observing. She watched him eat, sparingly at first, as if unaccustomed to regular meals. She mended his tattered shirt, stitching the worn fabric with neat, small stitches, leaving it folded on the simple cot she'd prepared for him in the small room off the kitchen. He never mentioned the mending, but she saw him touch the new seams, his fingers tracing the thread, a silent acknowledgement. At night, she would sometimes hear him, a muffled cry, a restless thrashing from his room. Nightmares clung to him, shadows from a past he kept locked away. She never spoke of it, offering instead a dipper of cool water if she met him in the darkened kitchen, his face pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. The townsfolk, when she went for supplies, were less circumspect. "Senior Ragman, Ilara," Jedediah Thorne would call out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Still wearing those fine wedding clothes?" Laughter would follow. She would flush, her lips tightening, but she'd offer no reply, gathering her meager purchases and retreating back to the isolation of the farm, where silence, at least, was honest. Silas never asked what was said. But sometimes, after a trip to town, she would see a new tension in his shoulders, a deeper shadow in his eyes, and she knew he understood. He was Ilara's ragman to them, a figure of scorn, a testament to her desperation. But to Ilara, as she watched him work, as she saw the quiet integrity in his steadfast labor, he was slowly, surely, becoming something more. He was Silas. And he was, against all odds, mending more than just fences on her broken farm. The fragile piece of their shared labor was inevitably shattered by the cruelty that festered in the heart of Redemption Gulch, a cruelty that found its most vocal expression in Jedediah Thorne and his sycophants, Burl and Hank. Thorn, a man whose sense of self-importance was inflated by his modest landholdings and the fear he could inspire in lesser men, seemed to take Silas's mere presence as a personal affront. Perhaps it was Ilara's quiet defiance in accepting such a man, or perhaps Thorn simply needed a target for the venom that soured his own existence. Their harassment began subtly, with loud, pointed remarks whenever Silas was in town for essential supplies. "Looky here, Burl, it's the Scarecrow come to life," Thorn would bray, ensuring a wide audience. Still feeding off Ilara Kane's charity, Ragman. Silas would not rise to the bait. His jaw would tighten, a muscle pulsing beneath the sun-weathered skin, his hands often clenching into fists at his sides, but his gaze would remain fixed ahead, his steps unwavering as he collected what Ilara needed, a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a length of rope. He would endure the jeers, the snickers, the way other townsfolk would suddenly find business elsewhere, unwilling to be associated with the object of Thorn's derision. Ilara witnessed these encounters more than once, her heart clenching with a helpless anger. She saw the effort it cost Silas to maintain his composure, the iron will that kept him from retaliating against the taunts that were like stones thrown at a tethered animal. Her own anger was a cold, slow burn, different from Thorn's bluster. It was the anger of the overlooked, the underestimated, now stirred to protect another who was similarly judged. The provocations escalated. One morning, Silas found the newly mended section of their pasture fence deliberately cut, the wires snipped and coiled back like mocking serpents. Another day, a small bag of feed Ilara had purchased was found slit open, its contents spilled and fouled in the dust of the livery stable where she'd briefly left the wagon. No one claimed responsibility, but Thorn's smug grin when she next saw him in town was an open admission. Silas said little, his face grim as he repaired the damage, his movements more forceful, a suppressed energy radiating from him. Ilara watched, her silence now a vessel for a gathering resolve. The turning point came on a market day, a rare occasion when Ilara brought a few baskets of early vegetables and eggs to sell. Silas had accompanied her, carrying the heavier baskets, his presence a quiet shield she hadn't asked for but deeply appreciated. They were by their small, makeshift stall when Thorn, flanked by Burl and Hank, swaggered over. Thorn, reeking of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction, picked up one of Ilara's carefully polished tomatoes, tossing it contemptuously in the air. "Slim pickings, Ilara. Much like your choice in husbands," he leered at Silas. "Still playing the silent scarecrow, Ragman? Cat got your tongue, or just no spine to speak of?" Burl, emboldened, reached out and deliberately knocked a basket of eggs from the edge of their table. They shattered on the dusty ground, a yellow, viscous mess. "Oops," he sniggered. Clumsy Mia. Silas tensed, his body coiling like a spring, and for a moment, Ilara thought he would finally break. His eyes, usually stormy, were now black with a contained fury. But then he visibly reined it in, his breath hissing out slowly. Before Silas could react, or more accurately, choose not to react, Ilara stepped forward. Her movement was not aggressive, but it was decisive, placing her small frame between Thorn's bulk and Silas. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as splintered ice, cutting through the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby stalls. "Mr. Thorn," she began, her gaze unwavering as it met his. "This man," she gestured slightly toward Silas, "has shown more decency and industry in a few short weeks than you have displayed in a lifetime of bullying. His clothes may be worn, but his character is not. He works from sunup to sundown to make an honest living on land that asks for sweat and heart, things you seem to reserve for tormenting those you deem beneath you." The onlookers, initially amused by Thorn's antics, were now silent, stunned by Ilara's quiet, articulate defense. Thorn's face mottled with surprise, then rage. "Why, you little," Ilara continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "These eggs," she pointed to the mess on the ground, "can be replaced. They are a small loss. But the dignity you try to strip from others, Mr. Thorn, that is a stain on your own soul, not theirs. You call him Ragman. I call him a man of quiet worth, something this town, and especially you, seem to have forgotten how to recognize." She bent, carefully picking up one unbroken egg from the edge of the disaster. She looked not at Thorn, but at Silas, and a small, almost imperceptible softening touched her lips. We have better things to do than trade words with empty barrels. Without another glance at the sputtering Thorn, she turned back to their stall. Silas stood frozen for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on her, a complex emotion swirling in their depths, surprise, gratitude, and something akin to awe. The quiet woman, the one they all pitied or ignored, had just faced down the town bully with nothing but the truth and an unshakable moral compass. Her perceived weakness, her silence, had become her most potent weapon. Jedediah Thorn was not a man accustomed to being publicly rebuked, especially not by a woman like Elara Kane, whom he had long dismissed as insignificant. Her quiet defense of Silas, her articulate condemnation of his own character, had lit a slow, sputtering fuse of humiliated rage within him. The town's subsequent murmurs, the subtle shift in some eyes from derision toward Silas to a grudging respect for Elara, only fanned the flames. Thorn felt his dominance, his carefully cultivated image as the town's strongman, threatened by a woman and her ragman. He would not stand for it. His desire for Elara's land, a nagging ambition that had always simmered beneath his contempt, now melded with a burning need for retribution. He would drive them out, break their nascent hope, and reclaim his perceived authority. He gathered Burl and Hank, their own bravado bolstered by Thorn's fury and a shared bottle of cheap whiskey. Tonight, Thorn growled, his face flushed, we teach that little mudhen and her scarecrow a lesson they won't forget. We'll make that farm so unwelcoming, they'll be begging to leave by sunrise. Their plan was crude, fueled by malice rather than cunning. They would start with fear, with destruction, aiming for the small, precious things. Elara's vegetable garden, nurtured with such care, became their first target under the cloak of a moonless night. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, a mournful sigh across the prairie as the three men crept towards the Kane homestead. Inside the small farmhouse, Elara was mending a tear in Silas's other shirt by the low light of a single lamp. Silas sat across the small table, cleaning a rusty hoe head, the rasp of metal on stone a strangely soothing sound in the quiet room. A sudden, sharp crack from outside, like wood splintering, made them both freeze. Silas was on his feet instantly, his head tilted, listening. Another sound, a thud, then the distinct, cruel snap of young plants being trampled. Elara's eyes widened. "My garden," she whispered, a hand flying to her mouth. Before she could say more, Silas moved, not towards the door, but to the corner where his battered valise lay. He opened it, and Elara caught a glimpse of something dark and heavy within before he quickly retrieved it and tucked it into the waistband of his trousers at the small of his back. It was not a farmer's tool. His face, illuminated by the lamplight, was a mask of grim resolve, the earlier storm in his eyes now a focused, dangerous calm. "Stay here, Elara." "Bolt the door," his voice was low, urgent. "No, Silas, they'll do as I say." There was no pleading in his tone, only a command born of immediate peril. He was out the door before she could argue further, melting into the deeper shadows of the porch. Heart pounding, Elara rushed to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. She saw them then, three dark figures moving through her garden, Thorn's distinctive bulk unmistakable. They were yanking up her tomato vines, stomping on her carefully tended squash. A wave of fury, cold and sharp, pierced through her fear. This was not just about vegetables, it was about violation, about malice. Silas moved like a phantom. He didn't charge. He circled, using the dilapidated shed and the woodpile as cover, his movements economical, precise. Thorn, emboldened by the lack of immediate response, let out a harsh laugh. "Not so talkative now, are you, ragman?" He kicked over a small trellis Elara had built for her beans. That was when Silas struck. He came out of the darkness behind Burl, a swift, silent rush. There was a dull thud, a grunt, and Burl crumpled to the ground. Hank spun around, startled, reaching for a heavy stick he carried. Silas was already moving, deflecting the clumsy blow with his forearm, his other hand shooting out in a short, brutal jab to Hank's throat. Hank choked, dropping his stick, stumbling back. Thorn, finally realizing this was not the cowering scarecrow he'd imagined, roared and charged, his fists flailing. Silas met the charge, not with brute force, but with a chilling efficiency. He sidestepped Thorn's clumsy lunge, his body moving with a trained grace that spoke of a past far removed from tilling soil. A quick succession of blows, hard and targeted, landed on Thorn's ribs and jaw. Thorn staggered, roaring in pain and surprise. He was bigger, heavier, but Silas was faster, his movements honed by a desperate purpose. The fight was short, brutal, and starkly illuminated by the sliver of moon that finally broke through the clouds. Ilara watched, her breath caught in her throat. This was not the quiet, enduring Silas she knew. This was a man pushed beyond his limits, a protector roused. Thorn, winded and bleeding from the mouth, backed away, his eyes wide with a fear he'd rarely known. Who are you?" he gasped. Silas didn't answer. He stood, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched, his silhouette a stark warning against the dark horizon. Just then, a light appeared down the track, a lantern swinging. "Ilara! Silas! You all right in there?" It was the stationmaster, Mr. Henderson, a shotgun cradled in his arm. He must have seen the men heading out of town or heard the commotion carried on the wind. His arrival broke the spell. Burl was groaning, trying to sit up. Hank was still gasping for air. Thorn, seeing his chance, turned and fled into the darkness, his bravado utterly shattered. Mr. Henderson surveyed the scene, his gaze sharp. "Looks like you handled the trash, Silas," he nodded towards the retreating Thorn. "Some folks just need a firm hand to learn their manners." Silas slowly unclenched his fists, the dangerous tension ebbing from his frame, leaving him looking weary, almost depleted. He turned towards the house, towards Ilara, who was already unbolting the door, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce pride. He had protected their home. He had protected her. The cost of that protection, she sensed, was a reopening of old wounds within him, but tonight, he had not been alone in his fight. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound quiet descended upon the small farm, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote, as if nature itself was sighing after the storm of human conflict. Mr. Henderson, after ensuring Burl and Hank were capable of slinking back to town under their own steam, and promising a stern word with the seldom-seen marshal about Thorn's transgressions, tipped his hat to Ilara and Silas. "You've got a good man there, Ilara," he said, his gaze lingering on Silas with newfound respect. "And you, Silas, found a woman worth fighting for." He left them then, his lantern light receding down the track, leaving them cocooned in the fragile peace of their shared ordeal. Ilara led Silas into the kitchen. His knuckles were bruised, a cut bleeding sluggishly above his eye. She gently pushed him into a chair and fetched a basin of water and clean cloths. Her touch was featherlight as she cleaned the cut, her silence no longer a barrier but a space of deep, unspoken communion. He watched her, his stormy eyes softer now, shadowed with a lingering pain that was more than physical. "They won't be back," he said, his voice raspy. "Not like that, I know," she whispered, dabbing at the cut. Her gaze met his, unwavering. "Thank you, Silas." He flinched almost imperceptibly at her gratitude, as if it were a burden. I didn't want to fight." His voice was low, heavy with a weariness that seemed to settle into his bones. "I've seen enough fighting to last a lifetime." Ilara paused, her hand hovering near his face. She sensed the ghosts that haunted him, the shadows of a past he carried like a shroud. "Who were you, Silas?" she asked gently, not with prying curiosity, but with a quiet desire to understand the man who had stood between her and harm. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, the words came, haltingly, painfully. "A soldier, once. Then, nothing. Lost everything. Everyone." He swallowed hard. Came west thinking, maybe a man could start over. Be forgotten. His eyes returned to hers, raw with vulnerability. "Didn't expect this. Didn't expect anyone to." He trailed off, unable to voice the fragile hope that had begun to take root in his desolate heart. Ilara's hand found his, her fingers closing gently around his bruised ones. "You're not nothing, Silas," she said, her voice imbued with a certainty that reached into the darkest corners of his despair. "You're here. You're real. And you are Good. The simple affirmation seemed to pierce through layers of his self-imposed isolation. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. In the days and weeks that followed, a subtle but profound shift occurred, not just on their small farm, but in Redemption Gulch itself. Thorne, humbled and nursing his injuries, kept a low profile. Burl and Hank avoided Ilara and Silas altogether. The townsfolk, having heard Mr. Henderson's account and witnessed Ilara's unwavering courage and Silas's quiet strength, began to offer small gestures of acceptance. A nod from the blacksmith. A hesitant smile from the storekeeper's wife. Offers of help with the harvest, which, against all odds, was proving to be a modest success under Silas's diligent care and the newly functioning well. The farm, too, began to reflect their mended spirits. The garden, though scarred, was replanted with late-season crops. The fences stood straight and strong. The house, cleaned and aired, seemed to breathe again. Silas, no longer Ilara's ragman, moved with a new lightness, the shadows in his eyes receding, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that now held a measure of peace. He still worked tirelessly, but now there was a purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was building something, with Ilara, for Ilara. And Ilara, no longer the pitted spinster, walked with a newfound confidence, her quiet smiles more frequent, her voice, when she spoke, carrying a gentle authority. She had found her strength not in changing who she was, but in embracing it, and in seeing the worth in another that the world had dismissed. One cool autumn evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the vast prairie sky, Ilara and Silas sat on the porch, a comfortable silence enveloping them. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He had mended the broken porch swing, and it moved with a gentle, rhythmic creak. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes of the journey they had undertaken, from desolation and despair to a shared sanctuary. "The sunflowers are turning their heads for the last time this year," Ilara observed softly, looking at the tall stalks, their bright faces now heavy with seeds. Silas followed her gaze. "They'll be back next spring," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stronger, maybe." He squeezed her hand. Like us, Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The rags of his arrival had long since been replaced by sturdy work clothes, mended with her care. But more than that, the rags of his spirit, and hers, were being rewoven into something resilient, something beautiful, something akin to love. True love, she realized, wasn't about grand pronouncements or flawless beginnings. It was about seeing the hidden worth, mending the broken pieces, and finding a shared strength in the face of a harsh world. It was about a quiet woman and a man in tatters, finding their redemption not in changing who they were, but in finally, truly, seeing each other. The seasons turned, each one etching a deeper pattern of contentment onto the landscape of their lives. Winter's stark white blanket gave way to the tender green shoots of spring, and spring, in turn, blossomed into the vibrant abundance of summer. The Kane farm, once a symbol of neglect and quiet desperation, now thrived under their shared diligence. The fields, coaxed into fertility by Silas's unyielding labor and Ilara's patient tending, yielded bountiful harvests. The house, no longer listing, stood firm and welcoming, its windows gleaming, smoke curling cheerfully from its chimney, a testament to the warmth within. Laughter, a sound rarely heard before, now echoed in the small yard, mingling with the contented clucking of plump chickens and the lowing of a healthy milk cow Silas had bartered for with their surplus grain. Silas Mercer was no longer the gaunt, haunted figure who had stepped off the train in rags. He stood taller, his frame filled out, his eyes, the color of a clearing sky after a storm, held a steady light. The lines of hardship on his face had softened, smoothed by peace and the quiet joy of belonging. He still worked with the same tireless dedication, but now his labor was infused with a sense of purpose that radiated from him, a quiet strength that needed no announcement. He was a man who had found his place, his anchor, in the heart of a woman who had dared to see beyond the desolate exterior to the steadfast soul within. Ilara Kane, too, was transformed. The shadows of loneliness that had once clung to her like a second skin had vanished, replaced by a serene radiance. Her quietness remained, but it was no longer the silence of fear or isolation, it was the comfortable, knowing silence of a woman cherished and secure. Her hands, once perpetually busy with solitary chores, now often found themselves clasped in Silas's, their shared touch a constant reaffirmation of the bond they had forged in hardship and nurtured with unwavering devotion. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch, who had once pitied or scorned them, now spoke of Ilara and Silas with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. They were a testament, living and breathing, to the profound truth that worth often lies hidden beneath the most unpromising surfaces, that love can bloom in the most arid soil, and that courage, sometimes, speaks in the softest voice. Jedediah Thorne had long since faded into the background, his bluster diminished, his cruelty finding no purchase against the solid reality of their shared happiness. The farm became a quiet landmark, a place where resilience had taken root and flourished. They had shown everyone not what love was supposed to look like according to pamphlets or preachers, but what it felt like, what it could build, what it could heal. It was in the way Silas's gaze would soften when he looked at Ilara across a field, in the gentle way she would lay a hand on his arm, in the unspoken understanding that flowed between them as easily as the prairie wind. They had sought little, expected less, and in their quiet corner of the world, they had found everything. Their love was not a grand, fiery spectacle, but a steady, warming flame, built from the kindling of shared sorrow and fanned by unwavering acceptance, a beacon against the lingering darkness, a quiet promise of dawn. If this story of Ilara and Silas stirred something in your soul, if you felt the raw ache of their loneliness and the quiet triumph of their connection, if you believe in a love that looks beyond the tattered edges of hardship to find the enduring strength within, then you are in the right place. Their journey reminds us that true sight comes not from the eyes, but from the heart, and that the most profound acts of love are often whispered in silences, mended in shared labors, and fought for with a quiet courage that demands no applause. We tell stories of the human spirit's resilience, of redemption found in unexpected places, and of love that defies the world's harsh judgments. If you crave more tales where the overlooked find their voice, where the broken are made whole not by magic but by unwavering human kindness, and where true love is the ultimate act of seeing and being seen, then subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories that dig deep into the heart of what it means to connect, to endure, and to find light in the most shadowed corners of our world. Subscribe now, and let these stories of quiet power and enduring love continue to inspire you.